Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters in our common humanity, thank you very much for coming, and thank you for having me here, and also thanks to Kevin for organising this and for all the other participants. Now, necessarily, we can't go into every facet of this debate. We're talking about abortion and assisted suicide, both of which are hugely nuanced subjects. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to try to do one simple thing, which is establish the first principles that we have when we come to the idea of rights and autonomy, and then apply them to these two subjects and see what comes out. Now, when it comes to abortion and assisted suicide, the arguments in favour of the legality of these practices often involve rights, the so-called right to choose and the so-called right to die, and these are justified in terms of autonomy. Now, I'm going to suggest that when we properly understand what rights are, you understand that there are reasonable limits to what we have a right to autonomously do. Now, I propose that the most rational metaphysical understanding of rights is the one that I would propose, which is the classical natural law tradition, which involves the doctrine of natural rights, and I'll briefly summarise it. We all share the same humanity. We all have a human nature. Our human nature has common faculties, ingestion, intellect, will, etc. And these faculties have purposes, the fulfilment of which constitutes our flourishing, the good for us. So, reason tells me that the purpose of ingestion is nutrition. So I flourish when I ingest moderate amounts of nutritious food. By contrast, if I have 20 donuts in front of me, if I have 3, maybe 5, that's not too bad, that won't hurt me particularly. But if I have all 20, I'm going to be violently ill. That's not going to be good for me. It's going to contradict the purpose of the faculty of my eating. Now, since we have intellect and will, this is where moral goodness enters the picture. Because as human beings, we can know what is good for us, and we can choose whether to pursue that good or not, which is precisely the natural purpose of our faculty of intellect, to allow us to understand the truth about things, including what is good for us given our nature, and our will, in fact, to act in light of this understanding in favour of the good. And this gives us a basic grounding of objective moral norms. Because there are purposes in our nature, the fulfilment of which constitutes the good for us, this becomes moral goodness because I can choose whether to fulfil the good in my actions or to frustrate it. And I'm obliged axiomatically to choose the good. And that's what we mean when we talk about the natural law. This is also where rights come in. Part of our nature is that we are social animals. We can't pursue any good or fulfill any obligation at all if our very lives could be taken from us by others as they saw fit. The natural law entails, therefore, that every human being, for the purposes of fulfilling that good within their nature, has a right not to be, for example, killed. And that is what we call the right to life. It's a natural or human right, that is to say it's a right that we have by virtue of the moral norms in our rational human nature, one which ought to be protected by law and by government. Finally, these basic natural human rights are negative rights. They are rights not to be interfered with in some way. This is as opposed to positive rights, the right to be given something by someone else. That will be relevant just a little bit later on. So, having established that foundation, this is what we ought to mean by rights. And given that there exist objective moral norms that give us these natural rights, I think it also gives us grounds to reject an understanding of autonomy in the relativist sense of being able to make up your morality as you go along. Rather, for autonomy to be meaningful, I think we have to understand it in the Kantian sense of the capacity of an agent to act in accordance with objective morality, rather than under the influence of our random desires. It's about will, having a free will by virtue of using our reason. I may have a right, or at least a neutral freedom, to freely move my hand through the air, but it stops when it reaches Kevin's face, and I'm sure he'd make me well aware of that fact if it happened. So, okay, having laid that foundation, are the two rights we discussed earlier on, the so-called right to choose and the so-called right to die, reasonably rights? Well, no, they're not. And we know that from simply looking at the things for which a right is being claimed. When applied to abortion, we ought to complete the incomplete phrase, right to choose. Right to choose what? No one's in favour of a right to choose anything. The right to choose what? Well, it's the right to choose to kill an unborn child, the youngest form of human being. That being the case, no, there is not a right to abortion, because it is not a neutral action by or on the pregnant mother's body exclusively, indifferent to any other human being. It is a lethal action on the body of the unborn child, i.e. one that results in her death. It therefore violates the human right to life that she possesses, and is thus not a reasonable act of bodily autonomy. Similarly, the so-called right to die is really just an irrational euphemism. Dying is a fact. We will all die. But when applied to suicide, we're talking about the right to try to kill yourself, or when applied to assisted suicide, we're talking about the right to have someone else help you kill yourself. So, since ending a life is the ultimate frustration of the purposes of our nature, of our moral purposes, Every human life has value and purpose while it exists. There is no right to end one's own life. Now, I'll give a little codicil to that. I think we should be free to try to end our own lives without being sanctioned by the state. Nonetheless, I don't think we have any right in being helped to do so. Even if there were a negative right, strictly speaking, to freely attempt to commit suicide, as opposed to simply a pragmatic liberty, this would not entail a positive right to be assisted, a positive right, remember, to be assisted in achieving suicide. And this is what assisted suicide would require. It's not a freedom, it's an entitlement to a certain kind of action given to you by others. Further, and this is another reason why assisted suicide is a violation of the idea of rights and autonomy, those who are terminally ill, or seriously, even if not mortally ill, or elderly, or disabled, or indeed any of the candidates notionally proposable for assisted suicide, these are all people who frequently have a severely compromised bodily autonomy and personal autonomy precisely due to their condition. Due to that, even if there were a right to the action of assisted suicide, it would be being applied to people most easily lethally compromised, at least by an indifferent culture, or if not by the subtly malicious pressure of others. It would thus endanger the right to life. So considering the nature of these things, I think this shows the shallowness of choice, quote-unquote, rhetoric when applied to abortion and assisted suicide. It more often than not, I'm not saying it will with any of the participants here, but it more often than not, in my experience, constitutes an abdication of the responsibility to seriously morally consider the object of choice. It glosses over the actually morally and legally relevant issue of what is being chosen, only in the light of which a right of autonomous action can be claimed. You can't, therefore, and I'll end on this point, you cannot absolutize autonomy as a dogma. The example that Kevin used, I think, was a really good one earlier.
The idea that you can have anything on request. So if I have a sexual fetish about amputation, then through what Anne's saying, I should be able to go and demand that my leg is cut off by a doctor. Equally, you might recall the rather horrific example of the German cannibals. Now, one German cannibal died whilst waiting. They had cut off his penis and were about to eat it, but the one whose penis was cut off died ahead of time. Taking it to this logical conclusion, we should actually have a doctor there to supervise that entire process, and thereby, in some ways, be approving of cannibalism, which I don't think most people will, and I don't think we'd want our medical resources to be used for such things.
Further, would it be a violation of your autonomy if I saved you during your act of trying to commit suicide? I don't think we would say it would, and similarly, you don't have the right to chop off your leg or get a doctor to do that for you. So when we understand the moral basis of rights, we understand what we have a right to autonomously do, and that this, therefore, includes neither abortion nor assisted suicide.